Our text this morning comes from John's Gospel, chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A vast crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left those who had eaten, and they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." And when Jesus realized that they were about to come to take him by force, to make him a king, he withdrew again to the mountains by himself. The word of God for you, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. Have you ever noticed that some people just give up before they ever try? Have you ever seen that? Yeah, sometimes it's the fear of failure. We just don't want to be labeled a failure, so we don't even try. And then sometimes, oddly enough, it's the fear of success. And we don't think we deserve to be successful. Somewhere in our life, someone told us we do not deserve to be successful. So we don't try. And sometimes our little computer between our ears just starts doing calculations. We say, "Oh, I'm too old, I'm too young, I'm too inexperienced, I don't have enough this, I don't have enough that. I was born on the wrong side of the tracks, in the wrong country, or in the wrong state, or even in the wrong county." Sometimes opportunity is something we just walk around and avoid. I don't think I ever had a more difficult Salkehatchie site before this year. We went there very energetic, very hope-filled, and we started to tear off the roof, 17 squares worth of roof. We began to tear it off to discover there were actually 5 roofs up there. So do the math on that one. We tore off 5 times 17 squares of shingles. And even on the ridge row, there were 6 layers on the ridge row. And then we had to start putting down roof because the rafters were rotten, and we had to replace a quarter-inch OSB with 3/4-inch OSB to make it strong. And as we started, a thunderstorm came up. And we had to roll the tarp back down, a tarp that had been up there for 10 years. And after it stopped raining, we went back up and started working again. And as soon as it came time to depart, around 4:30, 4:45, we rolled the tarp back down. A thunderstorm came during the night. And we get up the next morning and show up, and the living room ceiling is on the floor. So we have to clean that up. And then lunchtime, we went and ate and came back, and the dining room ceiling was on the floor. And we cleaned that up while we were putting roof up. And then the next day, we came in to find a bedroom ceiling on the floor. It was quite interesting. It seemed like we took 2 steps forward at times, didn't it, Maddie? And 1 step backwards. During all of this, we were removing and replacing rotten cabinetry, painting, putting down linoleum. And I could see some of the disappointment in the campers' eyes. So the last day, I told them a story. And I told them a story about a state championship football game I played in. I came from a small high school, Union, and we played high schools that graduated more people than we had in our whole school. But we went through 4 games before we were ever scored on. We were a good football team, and we went to the state and played Orangeburg-Wilkerson, and they dressed out over 90 players. We had 22. We played both ways, called Iron Man football. When we went on the field, we never came back off. Halftime, it was 13-0 our favor. But we were exhausted because Dick Sheridan, who went on to coach Furman and NC State, realized our weakness. They couldn't beat us on talent. They just beat us on quantity. And the whole first half, he just kept rotating people in and out, and they were fresh. So the second half, they tied the game 13-13. And with 2 minutes left in the ball game, we marched right down the field. And on the 15-yard line, we were trying to kick a field goal and had no timeouts, and the clock expired. And then we lost in penetration. And I remember getting on the bus, and captains had to sit with your coordinator. And I was a defensive captain, and I was sitting with the defensive coordinator on the front of the bus. And I was just sitting there, and there was a lot of sobbing going on back here. And the head coach, Paul Love, stepped on the bus, and he looked at me. He said, "You're not crying." And I said, "No, sir." He said, "Why aren't you crying?" And I said, "I don't have anything to cry for." And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And I said, "Coach, I gave you my best. That's all I had. And I'm not crying." And I told the team that if they gave their best at Salkehatchie, if they gave their best, there was no reason to feel disappointment. Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, was elected President of the United States. And he wrote a book in which he told about his graduating class at the Naval Academy. He finished, I think, 59th in his class. And he was trained in the nuclear stuff, and nuclear submarines were just coming on board. And Admiral Rickover was looking for personnel, and he invited then just Jimmy Carter to come and be interviewed about the new program. And Jimmy Carter went into the office, and Rickover said, "Jimmy, where did you graduate in your class?" And he said, 59th. And Admiral Rickover asked him, "Did you do your best?" And there was a long, uncomfortable, pregnant pause, and Jimmy Carter said, "No, sir, I never gave my best." And Admiral Rickover, can you imagine this, turned his back on him and stared at the wall behind the desk for a long 2 or 3 minutes, said Jimmy Carter, and then said, "Jimmy, why not the best? Why not the best?" I think it's an important question that is extremely relevant today. Because sometimes we just do enough to get by. You know, sometimes we don't do it all because we don't think we can do it perfectly. Sometimes we don't do it at all because we don't think it can be enough. So I think the question is apropos for today. Why don't we give God our best? I mean, we did make promises. Our parents made promises for us at our baptism, or we made promises at our baptism. We made promises when we joined this church or any church. We made promises. A covenant. We made a covenant, promises with God. So why not the best? Why not our best prayer? Why not our best worship? Why not our best study? Why not our best in relationships? It reminds me of this dramatic story today we have before us in the text. Jesus was apparently wanting to get away. He needed to get away from the eyes and the ears, the questions, the demands, the needs of this nomadic congregation that kept growing and following him around the Sea of Galilee. So he crosses the sea and climbs a mountain to get away from these people. But they find him anyway. You know, he wants to nurture his own soul. He wants to build himself up spiritually. But he doesn't have any downtime. They follow him right up the mountain onto the plain. They don't give him any peace. They may have walked around the sea. Some of them may have hitched a ride on a boat. We don't know. They just all show up there with Jesus. And it's an assorted group of people. There are old, there are young, there are children, there are adults, there are the wealthy, there are the poor, there are the connected, there are the disconnected, there are the wanted, and there are the put out and the shut out. They're all there in that crowd before Jesus that day. And when Jesus sees them, he doesn't get angry that they followed him up the mountain. Instead, he looks at them with compassion, and he doesn't put out a sign that says out to lunch or back in a while. His compassion makes him reach out and be concerned over their needs. And he knows that they're hungry. And he turns to the disciples and he says, well, it looks like we're going to have a few guests for lunch. Why don't we have a picnic? Nothing beats a good picnic on the side of a mountain looking over such a beautiful sea as the Sea of Galilee. So let's have lunch together. Let's eat together with our friends. Let's break bread together as a community of faith. He sees an opportunity. It's an opportunity to glimpse the heavenly banquet to come. When differences dissolve, the shortcomings dissolve, the angers, the animosities dissolve, and we all put our feet under God's table and eat at the heavenly banquet. Now the disciples, they didn't see it that way. Where Jesus is seeing all this in a very spiritual way, the disciples are seeing it purely physical. They're not seeing the spiritual opportunity. And they see an insurmountable problem. And Philip was the first one to speak up. You know, he's young, headstrong, and he does some quick calculations. You know, he thinks, just one hamburger off the dollar menu at McDonald's times 5,000, it's insurmountable. We don't have enough money in the checkbook. A picnic on the mountainside is a way out of their budget. Let's give this up. We don't even need to try. It's insurmountable. So, Philip just gives up without really trying. But then there's Andrew, the brother of Peter, Simon Peter. He doesn't give up. He does some calculations too, and like a good fundraiser, he starts going around pinching people. And he starts looking for resources. He starts looking for a way out of the problem. He tries to find a way to make this happen. So he looks for contributions, and he launches a second-mile giving campaign to fix this shortfall of resources against such a tremendous need. Well, as a fundraiser, Andrew's not all that successful. And I can just see the poor hope-filled disciple walking around, asking everybody sitting there in the grass, does anyone have extra food to share? Anyone? Hey folks, if you have extra, please share. Just raise your hand if you have an extra biscuit. Jesus needs your help. Out of 5,000 people, Andrew was only able to touch the heart and the soul of one little boy. One little boy. And this little boy puts forward his picnic lunch, which in the face of that congregation that day looked like 5 dinner rolls and 2 sardines. But that child, no doubt, was excited about the opportunity to give what he had, to give God his best. I guess when you work with God, you just have to throw out the expected. Just toss it, throw it away. David did that, and he offered his slingshot. Moses offered his staff, and God used both to change things. Now here's the thing, as some would say. God doesn't ask us to be impressive. God doesn't ask us to do things where we'll be noted. God just asks us to give what we have and do our best. God will always make it enough. God can change a human life through the smallest of gestures. The tiniest amount of resources. If we give that, God can use it to do great things. Not us doing the great things, God doing the great things. I'm reminded of something that happened 37 years ago. I did some calculation in my head of when it happened. I was in college serving a small congregation in Spartanburg, and Gail and I, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, so there wasn't a whole lot of resources we could just hand somebody. So I raised a very large garden right behind the church, and it was about 1.5 acres, big garden, and I did it all and picked it and everything, and Gail would can it, and we had closets full of soup mixture and green beans where Gail had canned. And when people would come off of Highway 221 needing food, we would give them that. It was the best we could do. Well, one Saturday morning, there was a knock on the church door. I was in my little study, about this big, studying for my sermon. And a knock came on the door, and I was introduced to a young man by the name of Raju Abraham. And Raju was Indian. And he had come over here to teach calculus in a small college in Kentucky. And the college closed down after 2 years. And no one else would hire him. And Raju fell into the migrant system. He went around picking tomatoes, he went around and picked peaches, etc., etc., etc. And he just got poorer and more distressed as the months and years went by. And when he knocked on the door of that church, he was emaciated. And he was dirty, his clothes were torn. He had been living under an overpass, and when he got chased out there, he would go down to the creek and live out there. And so he was back and forth, and he was bathing in the creek the best he could without soap. And he told me, he says, I'm hungry. Took him over to the parsonage. Parsonage was right beside the church. Took him over to the parsonage and cooked him a sandwich. And I looked at him and I said, he's about the size of Ed Brown. And Ed Brown was a church member. Fun guy. And so I called Ed and I said, you got any old clothes we can have? Yes. And Ed brought the clothes over to the parsonage. And there was this awful hotel, motel thing just down the road. And I called them, asked them, could we have a room? And they gave me a room for $10. So that tells you something, what kind of condition that place was in. $10 a day. So Raju ends up, we put him in the shower, and he gets him a shower, and get him some new clothes. And I tell him, I said, come back to church tomorrow. I want you to come to church tomorrow. He said, I'm too embarrassed to do that. I would love to. His great-grandfather, was the bishop of the Church of South India. And I think she actually started it there. I'm not sure, but he was the bishop of the Church of South India. He said, I'm too embarrassed to come looking like this to church. And I kept asking him to come, and he said no. But anyway, during the announcements, like I usually do, I was standing down front of the congregation, and I began to explain to the church, to that congregation, who Raju Abraham was. Now, this is not a wealthy congregation by any stretch of the imagination. That it was a Mill Hill textile community church, and the mill had been closed for almost 10 years. They didn't have much at all. And when I began to explain Raju to them, one lady said, well, I got an apartment over my garage. If he'll clean it out, he can stay up there, but it doesn't have any furniture. And another lady over here says, well, I got a couch. And a fellow said, well, I got a chair. And before you know it, we had an apartment full of furniture. And the lady that gave her apartment over the garage said, all he has to do is just cut my grass, just do some work around the house, it'd be fine. And he moved in. Later, he got his degree from chiropractic school. He became a chiropractor, and he saved enough money to bring his wife, Daisy, from India to Spartanburg. She was an RN nurse, and she became the RN nurse at Spartanburg Regional Hospital in the neuro unit. You know how that happened? People were willing to give what they had. That congregation was willing to do the best that they could. Whether it was big or small, they did the best they could. The Bible is full of people doing the little things and changing people in significant ways. It's filled with stories of people just giving God their best and letting God bless the effort and making it enough. Even 5 little dinner rolls and 2 sardines feeding 5,000 people. Abraham was a migrant from Ur. And he became the father of the covenant. Noah was an amateur carpenter. But through his effort, creation was spared. David was just a sheep herder. But with his slingshot, he spared his people. On and on it goes, of faith-filled, doing their best and giving what they had. And I'm going to close with one last story. And it's a story about Teddy Stollard and Miss Thompson. Teddy's mother, he was a child, and Teddy's mother died when he was very young, and his father literally had nothing to do with him. He basically raised himself with no encouragement, to do homework and to study and to get to school on time and those kinds of things. His grades really suffered. Now, back then, classes were self-contained. That one teacher in that classroom taught all the subjects. They were self-contained. And so Miss Thompson had Teddy all day long. And she realized from the first day that Teddy was in trouble. And she knew if something did not happen in Teddy's life, in his academic life, that he was going to be lost. So she decided to stay after class every day with Teddy and bring him up to speed. And it went on to Christmas time, and in that school, and I can remember this too, in that school there was Christmas parties. And children would bring a gift for the teacher. And it was kind of ceremonial. Each child would bring their gift up front and put it on the desk and then smile all the way back to their seat, knowing that they had brought the best gift in the classroom. Well, the children did that. And Teddy was the last one in line. And when he got there, he had a brown paper bag, all wrinkled and torn. And he stopped in front of Miss Thompson's desk, and he opened the bag, and he reached in, and he pulled out a rhinestone bracelet that was rusted with a lot of the rhinestones missing. And she saw it, and she said, "Oh, Teddy, that's the most beautiful bracelet I've ever seen." And she took it, and she put it on her wrist. And the children quit chuckling. They quit laughing when she did that. And then he reached in the paper bag, and he pulled out a used bottle of perfume. And she opened it, and she put some on her finger, and she dabbed it behind her ears. And she said, "Teddy, this is my favorite perfume." And when he went back to his seat, his head was tilted just a little further back, and there was a smile on his face, and there was spring in his step, and his shoulders were erect. Well, of course, he graduated from Miss Thompson's class and went on, and they lost connection with each other. And 5 or 6 years later, Miss Thompson got a letter. And it said, "I've graduated second in my high school class. I want to thank you for what you did for me." And about 4 years later, she got another letter. It said, "Miss Thompson, I graduated first in my college class. I want to thank you for what you did for me." And about 3 to 4 years later, she got another letter. And it said, "Miss Thompson, I just wanted you to know, I am now Dr. Theodore Stollard. Thank you for all that you did. Since my mother is dead and I don't know where my dad is, I'm getting married in a few months. Will you sit in my family's place? I have no other family but you." A life entirely transformed by a teacher, giving what she had and giving her best for another. And she did it with a simple smile and a simple thank you. And in the hands of God, little becomes much if it's given in the right spirit. Now we gather here around a meal that Jesus himself instituted. And he asks that we do it in remembrance of him. And I pray that we'll use this moment, that we will recovenate our lives with God, that we'll give what we have to his kingdom, and that we will give God our best efforts in all that we might do. Let us be open. Let us be expectant. Let us be available. Let us be willing. Let us give God our stale, our soggy, our bland picnic lunches and be ready for some great miracles among us. Amen.